Hello, everybody. This week, we're going to be choosing our books for our presentations, which is sort of a big task because you'll be spending several hours reading the book. You'll be spending a good amount of time putting together your presentation. It needs to match you and your taste and your interests. So, besides what I have in the module, I made this video so that I could give you a little bit of just background information on the books to help you pick one that matches you, matches your tastes. I'm going to ask you to be on your honor and that I'd like you to choose a book that you haven't read. I hope this book will help you choose one that interests you. Because some of the books are horror, some of them have some elements that are disturbing, and that's one reason I made this video so that I could give you a heads up about some of the issues, give you the opening to write me and ask me about some of the details of the books. But never hesitate to put a book aside if you find that it's bothering you. Write me and say, "Can I change books?" It's okay if you don't like the book because that you'll learn from that and you can decide what you don't want to do with your books. But that doesn't mean you have to read a book that makes you unhappy. And that's why I have you send me a list of your favorite books so that I can match the people with the books with the groups. Okay, so starting at the top of the list from your module, we have Jane Eyre, which may be familiar to a lot of you, by Charlotte Bronte. It's been called the first feminist novel, so it's interesting from that respect. It is long. It is written with the dense style of the early 19th century, but it is at times strikingly modern. I like Jane Eyre a lot, and I recommend it if you have not read it before. Love Story by Eric Siegel is quite different from Jane Eyre in terms of length and density. It is not known as a book full of great writing, and it is dated. It's from the early 1970s, but it sold many, many copies. And if you're interested in writing romance, you probably want to read a huge bestseller with the title Love Story. Its catchphrase, "Love means never having to say you're sorry," has entered the lexicon. You may have heard that. Many people, including me, argue vociferously with this phrase, saying that it's not true. You should never hesitate to tell people you love that you're sorry. Nevertheless, this book was very big in the 70s. It is interesting for its first line, which tells you how the love story turned out, which seems to be a little odd. It's also interesting for the fact that it may actually be more about the male protagonist relationship with his father than with his lover, but father-son relationships are about love too. So if that interests you, check it out. Ghost Story by Peter Straub is a sprawling thing that sprang from a research project in which he read all the ghost stories he could find. He is a friend of Stephen King's, and King talks about this book at length in your text, Danse Macabre. So if this is the kind of fiction you like to read and write, check out Ghost Story. It is a little bit dated. It's from the 1970s, but it defined the genre at the time. Mexican Gothic by Sylvia Moreno Garcia is a recent book. It was clearly and obviously inspired by Gothic classics like Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. It includes some images of horror that were more disturbing than I expected for this book. So be aware of that. And the sexual angle to the torment of the heroine was disturbing to me. That said, I did enjoy the book. In short, it's closer to a modern horror novel than, say, Jane Eyre is. But I think you'll enjoy it if you're into horror. I also enjoyed seeing familiar tropes from the Gothic books being portrayed in terms of a less Eurocentric society in Mexico. The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson is a seminal work of horror fiction from the early 1960s. It is much more about mood and style than out-and-out horror or gross out, as Stephen King would say. Shirley Jackson was an amazing prose stylist. If those things are down your alley, consider that book. We have two books by Colson Whitehead, Zone 1 and The Alienist. I find these books notable because they're relatively recent. They are works of genre fiction that are written by a very literary writer who has won multiple Pulitzer Prizes. Zone 1 is an out-and-out zombie novel, and it has scenes of gut-churning horror, which you would expect from a zombie book. The Alienist is a very moody, dark, science-fictional portrayal of racial prejudice in an alternate history setting. Very interesting. Colson Whitehead's first Pulitzer winner, The Underground Railroad, has fantasy elements. You're welcome to read that, but I have not gotten around to reading it yet. So I have not put it on the list of your course materials. If it appeals to you, you may read it, so let me know. The Time Machine by H.G. Wells is just basically the time travel story that started it all. There are other time travel books, some of them are on this list, but it was the first big name story that involved science, a time travel machine to take people through time instead of magic or a dream. Frankenstein in Baghdad is a quite recent book by Ahmed Sadawi. It is an interpretation of the Frankenstein myth set in post-Desert Storm Iraq. The carnage of war is upsetting, but the portrayal of a story that's familiar to us, Frankenstein, in a culture that is unfamiliar to me and maybe unfamiliar to you, I found that fascinating. So it's on the list and recommended. The Hounds of the Baskervilles takes us back to the 1800s by Arthur Conan Doyle. It's a Sherlock Holmes story. It's a seminal work of detective fiction, but it also has Gothic elements, the moors, the English countryside, the foreboding country home, that make it an interesting match for this class and for the non-mystery Gothics like Jane Eyre. Beloved by Toni Morrison is a towering work of fiction, highly recommended. Dealing as it does with the aftermath of slavery, it covers some very upsetting themes, but Morrison's beautiful prose is a reward. The Body Snatchers by Jack Finney is a science fictional treatment of mid-20th century paranoia. The phrase pod people, which you may have heard, has entered the language from this book. It is a bit dated because it's rather old, but it's influenced so many things that came after and asks questions about what is human, what distinguishes us from aliens that look like humans. The Stepford Wives by Eyre is a horror treatment of mid-20th century paranoia, as The Body Snatchers was. The phrase Stepford Wives has also entered the language. If you have seen any of the movies, you may be surprised by the book, so that may intrigue you. The Doomsday Book by Connie Willis is a time travel story, another time travel story, and it's a story of time, fate, and grief. If the medieval world intrigues you, you will probably appreciate this book because the time travel takes our heroine back to the 1400s. It is a particularly appropriate book to read now as it deals with pandemics in both time frames, the past and the future. A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain is a very early time travel story. It actually predates the Time Machine, but it is one of those time travel stories that does not involve science to get the man back in time. But it does still hold a slot as an influential time travel story. We Have Always Lived in a Castle by Shirley Jackson is very creepy and very Gothic. We have a family with dark secrets terrorized by bigoted townspeople. Jackson's use of image and point of view particularly is masterful. This one made a mark on me at a young age. Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston is the story of a woman battling racism and sexism in 1920s Florida. She's looking for self-actualization that does not depend on a man, which is hard to find in that place in that time for that person. She also dodges hurricanes and other natural menaces along the way of her quest. So Their Eyes Were Watching God. The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien is another quest novel, more of a classic quest novel. If you know The Lord of the Rings, but not The Hobbit, now's your excuse to read it. Dracula by Bram Stoker is the grandfather of all vampire novels. If you're into horror and you haven't read Dracula, then now is your chance. You should probably grab it. The Historian by Elizabeth Sakova is a relatively recent bestseller in the 21st century. It features vampirism. It actually features Dracula. It should be of particular interest to you as students because she wrote it while a student in a graduate writing program. So she wrote it as a relatively inexperienced writer, and it was a huge bestseller. Salem's Lot by Stephen King has been a major influence on vampire novels of the past 40 years. He wrote it, and consciously chose where to differ from Dracula in his mythology, and he discusses that in Danse Macabre. So you'll find his commentary interesting as you put your presentation together on this book. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson visits Freud's theory of the id before Freud published his theory of the id. You probably know the term Jekyll and Hyde, but you may not know exactly what it means if you have not read the book. Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier is a conscious descendant of Jane Eyre. She intended to bring Jane Eyre into the 20th century, and it's an excellent example of a 20th century Gothic novel. Alfred Hitchcock made a wonderful movie about Rebecca if you're interested in Hitchcock. Rosemary's Baby by Eyre 11 is a sharp social satire of 1960s New York that highlights the paranoia of the early Cold War years, which we've got several books that do that. It also was a very intriguing movie. So Rosemary's Baby. A Wrinkle in Time by Madeline Lingle is a science fiction novel, a young adult coming-of-age novel, and a quest story. It's written for children, unlike the others on this list, but I've loved it since I was 10, so I put it on the list. So if you have more questions about the books, let me know. Otherwise, pick one to start reading. That presentation is going to come sooner than you think, than any of us think. I hope you enjoy the books. Let me know if you do. All right, talk to you soon.